Section 44 of the 30 Years' War by Samuel Rawson Gardiner. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by Pamela Nagami. Chapter 10, Section 3. The Struggle for Alsace, January 1638 to July 1639. The year 1638 was to decide the question. Bernard was looking to the Austrian lands in Alsace and the Breisgau as a compensation for his lost duchy of Franconia. In February he was besieging Rheinfelden. Driven off by the imperialists on the 26th, he reappeared unexpectedly on March 3rd, taking the enemy by surprise. They had not even sufficient powder with them to load their guns, and the victory of Rheinfelden was the result. On the 24th, Rheinfelden itself surrendered. Freiburg followed its example on April 22nd, and Bernard proceeded to undertake the siege of Breisach, the great fortress which domineered over the whole valley of the Upper Rhine. Small as his force was, he succeeded, by a series of rapid movements, in beating off every attempt to introduce supplies, and on December 19th he entered the place in triumph. The campaign of 1638 was the turning point in the struggle between France and the united House of Austria. A vantage ground was then won which was never lost. Bernard himself, however, was loath to realize the worldwide importance of the events in which he had played his part. He fancied that he had been fighting for his own, and he claimed the lands which he had conquered for himself. He received the homage of the citizens of Breisach in his own name. He celebrated a Lutheran Thanksgiving festival in the cathedral. But the French government looked upon the rise of an independent German principality in Alsace with as little pleasure as the Spanish government had contemplated the prospect of the establishment of Wallenstein in the Palatinate. They ordered Bernard to place his conquests under the orders of the King of France. Strange as it may seem, the man who had done so much to tear in pieces the empire believed in a sort of way in the empire still. "I will never suffer," he said in reply to the French demands, "that men can truly reproach me with being the first to dismember the empire." The next year he crossed the Rhine with the most brilliant expectations. Bonner had recovered strength and was pushing on through North Germany into Bohemia. Bernard hoped that he too might strike a blow which would force on a peace on his own conditions. But his greatest achievement, the capture of Breisach, was also his last. A fatal disease seized upon him when he had hardly entered upon the campaign. On July 8th, 1639, he died. There was no longer any question of the ownership of the fortresses in Alsace and the Breisgau. French governors entered into possession. A French general took the command of Bernard's army. For the next 2 or 3 years Bernard's old troops fought up and down Germany in conjunction with Bonner, not without success, but without any decisive victory. The French soldiers were becoming like the Germans, inured to war. The lands on the Rhine were not easily to be wrenched out of the strong hands which had grasped them. End of section 44. Section 45 of the 30 Years' War by Samuel Rawson Gardiner. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by Pamela Nagami. Chapter 10, Section 4. French Successes, July 1639 to December 1642. Richelieu had other successes to count besides these victories on the Rhine. In 1637, the Spaniards drove out of Turenne the Duchess Regent Christina, the mother of the young Duke of Savoy. She was a sister of the King of France, and even if that had not been the case, the enemy of Spain was, in the nature of the case, the friend of France. In 1640 she re-entered her capital with French assistance. At sea, too, where Spain, though unable to hold its own against the Dutch, had long continued to be superior to France, the supremacy of Spain was coming to an end. During the whole course of his ministry, Richelieu had paid special attention to the encouragement of commerce and the formation of a navy. Troops could no longer be dispatched with safety to Italy from the coasts of Spain. In 1638 a French squadron burnt Spanish galleys in the Bay of Biscay. In 1639 a great Spanish fleet on its way to the Netherlands was strong enough to escape the French, who were watching to intercept it. It sailed up the English Channel, with the not distant goal of the Flemish ports almost in view. But the huge galleons were ill-manned and ill-found. They were still less able to resist the lighter, well-equipped vessels of the Dutch fleet, which was waiting to intercept them, than the Armada had been able to resist Drake and Raleigh 51 years before. The Spanish commanders sought refuge in the Downs under the protection of the neutral flag of England. The French ambassador pleaded hard with the King of England to allow the Dutch to follow up their success. The Spanish ambassador pleaded hard with him for protection to those who had taken refuge on his shores. Charles saw in the occurrence an opportunity to make a bargain with one side or the other. He offered to abandon the Spaniards if the French would agree to restore his nephew Charles Louis, the son of his sister Elizabeth, to his inheritance in the Palatinate. He offered to protect the Spaniards if Spain would pay him the large sum which he would want for the armaments needed to bid defiance to France. Richelieu had no intention of completing the bargain offered to him. He deluded Charles with negotiations, while the Dutch admiral treated the English neutrality with scorn. He dashed amongst the tall Spanish ships as they lay anchored in the Downs. Some he sank, some he set on fire. 11 of the galleons were soon destroyed. The remainder took advantage of a thick fog, slipped across the straits, and placed themselves in safety under the guns of Dunkirk. Never again did such a fleet as this venture to leave the Spanish coast for the harbours of Flanders. The injury to Spain went far beyond the actual loss. Coming, as the blow did, within a few months after the surrender of Breisach, it all but severed the connection for military purposes between Brussels and Madrid. Charles at first took no umbrage at the insult. He still hoped that Richelieu would forward his nephew's interests, and he even expected that Charles Louis would be placed by the King of France in command of the army, which had been under Bernard's orders. But Richelieu was in no mood to place a German at the head of those well-trained veterans, and the proposal was definitively rejected. The King of England, dissatisfied at this repulse, inclined once more to the side of Spain. But Richelieu found a way to prevent Spain from securing even what assistance it was in the power of a king so unpopular as Charles to render. It was easy to enter into communication with Charles's domestic enemies. His troubles, indeed, were mostly of his own making, and he would doubtless have lost his throne whether Richelieu had stirred the fire or not. But the French minister contributed all that was in his power to make the confusion greater, and encouraged as far as possible the resistance which had already broken out in Scotland, and which was threatening to break out in England. The failure of 1636 had been fully redeemed. No longer attacking any one of the masses of which the Spanish monarchy was composed, Richelieu placed his hands upon the lines of communication between them. He made his presence felt, not at Madrid, at Brussels, at Milan, or at Naples, but in Alsace, in the Mediterranean, in the English Channel. The effect was as complete as is the effect of snapping the wire of a telegraph. At once the peninsula startled Europe by showing signs of dissolution. In 1639 the Catalonians had manfully defended Roussillon against a French invasion. In 1640 they were prepared to fight with equal vigour. But the Spanish government, in its desperate straits, was not content to leave them to combat in their own way, after the irregular fashion which befitted mountaineers. Orders were issued commanding all men capable of fighting to arm themselves for the war, all women to bear food and supplies for the army on their backs. A royal edict followed, threatening those who showed themselves remiss with imprisonment and the confiscation of their goods. The cord which bound the hearts of the Spaniards to their king was a strong one, but it snapped at last. It was not by threats that Richelieu had defended France in 1636. The old traditions of provincial independence were strong in Catalonia, and the Catalans were soon in full revolt. Who were they to be driven to the combat by menaces, as the Persian slaves had been driven on at Thermopylae by the blows of their masters' officers? Equally alarming was the news which reached Madrid from the other side of the peninsula. Ever since the days of Philip II, Portugal had formed an integral part of the Spanish monarchy. In December 1640, Portugal renounced its allegiance and reappeared among European states under a sovereign of the House of Braganza. Everything prospered in Richelieu's hands. In 1641, a fresh attempt was made by the partisans of Spain to raise France against him. The Count of Soissons, a prince of the blood, placed himself at the head of an imperialist army to attack his native country. He succeeded in defeating the French forces sent to oppose him not far from Sedan. But a chance shot, passing through the brain of Soissons, made the victory a barren one. His troops, without the support of his name, could not hope to rouse the country against Richelieu. They had become mere invaders, and they were far too few to think of conquering France. Equal success attended the French arms in Germany. In 1641, Guebriant, with his German and Swedish army, defeated the imperialists at Wolfenbüttel in the north. In 1642, he defeated them again at Kempten in the south. In the same year, Roussillon submitted to France. Nor was Richelieu less fortunate at home. The conspiracy of a young courtier, the last of the efforts of the aristocracy to shake off the heavy rule of the cardinal, was detected and expiated on the scaffold. Richelieu did not long survive his latest triumph. He died on December 4th, 1642. End of section 45. Section 46 of the 30 Years' War by Samuel Rawson Gardiner. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by Pamela Nagami. Chapter 10, Section 5. Aims and Character of Richelieu, December 1642 to May 1643. Unlike Louis XIV and Napoleon, Richelieu counts among those few French statesmen whose fortune mounted with their lives. It is not difficult to discover the cause. As in Gustavus, love of action was tempered by extreme prudence and caution. But in Richelieu, these ingredients of character were mingled in different proportions. The love of action was far less impetuous. The caution was far stronger. No man had a keener eye to distinguish the conditions of success, or was more ready to throw aside the dearest schemes when he believed them to be accompanied by insuperable difficulties. Braver heart never was. There was the highest courage in the constancy with which he, an invalid, tottering for years on the brink of the grave, and supported by a king whose health was as feeble as his own, faced the whole might of the aristocracy of France. If he was harsh and unpitying, it was to the enemies of the nation, to the nobles who trod under their feet the peasant and the serf, and who counted the possession of power merely as the high road to the advancement of their private fortunes. The establishment of a strong monarchical power was, as France was then constituted, the only chance for industry and commerce to lift up their heads, for the peaceable arts of life to develop themselves in security, for the intellect of man to have a free course, and for the poor to be protected from oppression. All this was in Richelieu's heart, and some little of this he accomplished. The work of many generations was in this man's brain. Yet he never attempted to do more than the work of his own. As Bacon sketched out the lines within which science was to move in the days of Newton and of Faraday, so Richelieu sketched out the lines within which French statesmanship was to move in the days of Colbert and of Turgot, or in those of the Great Revolution itself. All things for the people, nothing by the people. This maxim, attributed to Napoleon, embodied as well the policy of Richelieu. In it are embalmed the strength and weakness of French statesmanship. The late growth of the royal power and the long continuance of aristocratic oppression threw the people, helpless and speechless, into the arms of the monarchy. They were happy if someone should prove strong enough to take up their cause without putting them to the trouble or the risk of thinking and speaking for themselves. It is no blame to Richelieu if, being a Frenchman of the 17th century, he worked under the only conditions which Frenchmen of the 17th century would admit. We can well fancy that he would think with scorn and contempt of the English Revolution, which was accomplishing itself under his eyes. Yet in the England of the Civil War, men were learning not merely to be governed well, but to know what good government was. It was a greater thing for a nation to learn to choose good and to refuse evil, even if the progress was slow, than to be led blindfold with far more rapid steps. Richelieu's foreign policy was guided by the same deep calculation as his home policy. If at home he saw that France was greater than any faction, he did not arrive at the far higher notion that Europe was greater than France, excepting so far as he saw in the system of intolerance supported by Spain an evil to be combated for the sake of others who were not Frenchmen. But there is no sign that he really cared for the prosperity of other nations when it was not coincident with the prosperity of France. As it is for the present generation a matter of complete indifference whether Breisach was to be garrisoned by Frenchmen or imperialists, it would be needless for us, if we regarded Richelieu's motives alone, to trouble ourselves much with the later years of the 30 Years' War. But it is not always by purity of motive only that the world's progress advances. Richelieu, in order to make France strong, needed help, and he had to look about for help where the greatest amount of strength was to be found. An ordinary man would have looked to the physical strength of armies, as Wallenstein did, or to the ideal strength of established institutions, as Ferdinand did. Richelieu knew better. He saw that for him who knows how to use it, there is no lever in the world like that of a rising cause. For a rising cause embodies the growing dissatisfaction of men with a long-established evil, which they have learned to detest, but which they have not yet learned to overthrow. In England, Richelieu was on the side of parliamentary opposition to the crown. In Germany, he was on the side of the opposition of the princes against the emperor. In Italy, he was on the side of the independence of the states against Spain. In the peninsula, he was on the side of the provinces against the monarchy. There is not the slightest reason to suppose that he cared one atom for any of these causes, except so far as they might promote his own ends. Yet in every case he selected those causes by which the real wants of the several countries were best expressed. It is this which distinguishes Richelieu from those who in later times have measured the foreign policy of France by French interests alone. They have taken up any cause which promised to weaken a powerful neighbour, without considering what the cause was worth. They favoured Italian division in 1860 and German division in 1870. Richelieu had a clearer insight into the nature of things than that. There can be no doubt that he would far rather have attacked Spain and Austria through the instrumentality of the League than through the instrumentality of Gustavus and the Protestants. But he saw that the future was with Gustavus and not with the League. He sacrificed his wishes to his policy. He coquetted with the League, but he supported Gustavus. When once Richelieu had gained his point, he was contented with his success. He never aspired to more than he could accomplish, never struck excepting for a purpose, never domineered through the mere insolence of power. He took good care to get Alsace into his hands, and to make himself master of the passes of the Alps by the possession of Pignerol. But he never dreamed of founding, like Napoleon, a French Confederation of the Rhine, or a French Kingdom of Italy. His interference with his neighbours was as little obtrusive as possible. Richelieu was quickly followed to the grave by the sovereign in whose name he had accomplished so much. Louis XIII died on the 14th of May, 1643. End of section 46. Section 47 of the 30 Years' War by Samuel Rawson Gardiner. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by Pamela Nagami. Chapter 10, Section 6. More French Victories, May 1643 to August 1645. His son and successor, Louis XIV, was a mere child. His widow, Anne of Austria, claimed the regency and forgot that she was the sister of the King of Spain and the sister-in-law of the Emperor, in the thought that she was the widow of one King of France and the mother of another. Her minister was Cardinal Mazarin, an Italian, who had commended himself to Richelieu by his capacity for business and his complete independence of French party feeling. If he was noted rather for cleverness than for strength of character, he was at least anxious to carry out the policy of his predecessor and to maintain the predominance of the crown over aristocratic factions. And for some time Richelieu's policy seemed to carry success with it through the impetus which he had given it. On May 19th, 1643, a victory came to establish the new authority of the Queen Regent, the first of a long series of French victories, which was unbroken till the days of Marlborough and Blenheim. The Spaniards had crossed the frontier of the Netherlands and were besieging Rocroi. The command of the French forces was held by the Duc d'Enghien, better known to the world by the title which he afterwards inherited from his father as the Prince of Condé. Next to Gaston, Duke of Orléans, the late king's brother, he and his father stood first in succession to the throne, and had for this reason attached themselves to Richelieu when he was opposed by the great bulk of the aristocracy. Those who placed him at the head of the army probably expected that a prince so young and so inexperienced would content himself with giving his name to the campaign and would leave the direction of the troops to older heads. The older heads, after reconnoitring the Spanish position at Rocroi, advised Enghien not to fight. But there was a certain Gassion among the officers who had served under Gustavus, and who had seen the solid legions of Tilly break down before the swift blows of the Swedish king at Breitenfeld. Gassion had learned to look upon that close Spanish formation with contempt, and he strove hard to persuade Enghien to give orders for the attack. And truth to say, he had no very hard task. Enghien was young and sanguine, and whether he had a genius for war or not, he had at least a genius for battles. Already conscious of the skill with which he was to direct the fortunes of many a well-fought field, he heartily adopted the views laid before him by Gassion. Rocroi was, so to speak, a second edition of Breitenfeld, a victory gained by vigour and flexibility over solid endurance. Unreasoning obedience once more gave way before disciplined intelligence. The Spanish masses stood with all the strength of a medieval fortress. There was no manoeuvring power in them. The French artillery ploughed its way through the ranks, and the dashing charges of the infantry drove the disaster home. The glories of the Spanish armies, the glories which dated from the days of the great captain, were clouded for ever. Yet if victory was lost to Spain, the cherished honour of the Spanish arms was safe. Man by man, the warriors fell in the ranks in which they stood, like the English defenders of the banner of Harold at Senlac. Their leader, the Count of Fuentes, an old man worn with years and gout, and unable to stand, was seated in an armchair to direct the battle within a square composed of his veteran troops. Death found him at his post. He had fought in the old wars of Philip II, the last of a long heroic race of statesmen and soldiers, had bowed his head before the rising genius of France. Thionville was then besieged. It surrendered in August. The cautious Richelieu had been contented to announce that he reserved all question of the ownership of his conquests till it should be finally determined by a treaty of peace. After Rocroi, Mazarin had no such scruples. Thionville was formally annexed to France. A medal was struck on which hope was borne in the hand of victory, and on which was inscribed the legend Prima finium propagatic. In Germany, the campaign of 1643 was less successful. Maximilian of Bavaria had put forth all his resources, and his generals, the dashing John of Werth and the prudent Mercy, of whom it was said that he knew the plans of the enemy as well as if he had sat in their councils, were more than a match for the French commanders. In 1644 they were opposed by a soldier of a quality higher than their own. Turenne was sent amongst them, but his forces were too few to enable him to operate with success. Freiburg in the Breisgau was taken before his eyes. Breisach was threatened. Then Enghien came with 10,000 men to assume the command over the head of the modest soldier who had borne the weight of the campaign. Proud of his last year's victory, he despised the counsel of Turenne that it was better to outmanoeuvre the enemy than to fight him in an almost inaccessible position. The battle fought amongst the vineyards of Freiburg was the bloodiest battle of a bloody war. For 3 days Enghien led his men to the butchery. At last Mercy, unable to provide food any longer for his troops, effected his retreat. The French reaped the prizes of a victory which they had not gained. On the 3rd of August, 1645, a second battle of Nördlingen was fought. It was almost a repetition of the slaughter of Freiburg. As in the year before, Turenne had been left to do the hard work at the opening of the campaign with inferior forces, and had even suffered a check. Once more Enghien came up, gay and dashing, at the head of a reinforcement of picked men. Once more a fearful butchery ensued. But that Mercy was slain early in the fight, the day might have gone hard with the French. As it was, they were able to claim a victory. The old German bands which had served under Bernat held out to the uttermost and compelled the enemy to retreat. But the success was not lasting. The Imperialists received reinforcements, and the French were driven back upon the Rhine. The same year had opened with splendid expectations on the other side of the theatre of the war. The gouty Swedish general Torstensson, who had taken up Banner's work in the north, burst suddenly into Bohemia, and on the 6th of March inflicted a crushing defeat on the imperialists at Jankuf. He then harried Moravia and pressed on to lay siege to Vienna, as if to repair the fault which it was the fashion to ascribe to Gustavus. But Vienna was unassailable, and Torstensson, like Turenne, was driven to retreat. He next tried to reduce Brünn. Failing in this, he returned to Bohemia, where, worn out with his maladies, he delivered over the command to Wrangel, his appointed successor. End of section 47. Section 48 of the 30 Years' War by Samuel Rawson Gardiner. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Pamela Nagami. Chapter 11. The End of the War. Section 1. Turenne's Strategy, June 1645 to October 1648. At last the thought entered into men's minds that it was time to put a stop to this purposeless misery and slaughter. It was hopeless to think any longer of shaking the strong grasp of France upon the Rhine, and if Sweden had been foiled in striking to the heart of the Austrian monarchy, she could not be driven from the desolate wilderness which now, by the evil work of men's hands, stretched from the Baltic far away into the interior of Germany. Long ago the disciplined force which Gustavus had brought across the sea had melted away, and the Swedish army was now like other armies, a mere collection of mercenaries, without religion, without pity, and without remorse. Negotiations for peace were spoken of from time to time, and preparations were at last made for a great meeting of diplomatists. In order to prevent the usual quarrel about precedency, it was decided that some of the ambassadors should hold their sittings at Osnabrück and the others at Münster, an arrangement which was not likely to conduce to a speedy settlement. The emperor proved his sincerity by sending his representatives early enough to arrive at Münster in July 1643, while the Swedish and French ambassadors only made their appearance in the March and April of the following year, and it was only in June 1645 that the first formal proposition was handed in. All who were concerned were in fact ready to make peace, but they all wished it made on their own terms. Ferdinand III was not bound by his father's antecedents. The Edict of Restitution had been no work of his. Long before this he had been ready to give all reasonable satisfaction to the Protestants. He had declared his readiness to include Calvinists as well as Lutherans in the religious peace. He had offered to restore the Lower Palatinate to Frederick's son, and he actually issued a general amnesty to all who were still in arms. But he shrank from the demand that these arrangements of the Empire should be treated of, not in the constitutional assemblies of the Empire, but in a Congress of European powers. To do so would be to tear the last veil from the sad truth that the Empire was a mere shadow, and that the states of which it was composed had become practically independent sovereignties. And behind this degradation lay another degradation, hardly less bitter to Ferdinand. The proudest title of the great emperors of old had been that of increaser of the empire. Was he to go down to posterity with the title of diminisher of the empire? And yet it was beyond his power to loosen the hold of France upon Alsace or of Sweden upon Pomerania. Nor was it only as emperor that Ferdinand would feel the loss of Alsace deeply. Together with the Breisgau, it formed one of the territories of the House of Austria, but it was not his own. It was the inheritance of the children of his uncle Leopold. and he was loath to purchase peace for himself by agreeing to the spoliation of his orphan nephews. Maximilian of Bavaria viewed the question of peace from another point of view. To him, Alsace was nothing, and he warmly recommended Ferdinand to surrender it for the sake of peace. If concessions were to be made at all, he preferred making them to Catholic France rather than to the Protestants in the empire. And he was convinced that if Alsace remained under French rule, the motive which had led France to support the Protestants would lose its chief weight. But besides these general considerations, Maximilian, like Ferdinand, had a special interest of his own. He was resolved, come what might, to retain at least the Upper Palatinate, and he trusted to be seconded in his resolve by the good offices of France. The position of Maximilian was thus something like that of John George of Saxony in 1632. He and his chief ally were both ready for peace, but his ally stood out for higher terms than he was prepared to demand. And as in 1632, Wallenstein saw in the comparative moderation of the Elector of Saxony only a reason for driving him by force to separate his cause from that of Gustavus, so in 1646 the French government resolved to fall upon Bavaria and to force the Elector to separate his cause from that of Ferdinand. The year before, the Elector of Saxony, crushed and ruined by the Swedes, had consented to a separate truce, and now Turenne was commissioned to do the same with Bavaria. In August he effected a junction on the lawn with Wrangel and the Swedes, and if Enghien had been there, history would doubtless have had to tell of another butchery, as resultless as those of Freiburg and Nordlingen. But Enghien was far away in Flanders, laying siege to Dunkirk, and Turenne, for the first time at the head of a superior force, was about to teach the world a lesson in the art of war. Whilst the enemy was preparing for the expected attack by entrenching his position, the united French and Swedish armies slipped past them and marched straight for the heart of Bavaria, where an enemy had not been seen since Bernard had been chased out in 1634. That one day, as Turenne truly said, altered the whole face of affairs. Everywhere the roads were open, provisions were plentiful, the population was in the enjoyment of the blessings of peace. Turenne and Wrangel crossed the Danube without difficulty. Schorndorf, Würzburg, Nordlingen, Donauwörth made no resistance to them. It was not till they came to Augsburg that they met with opposition. The enemy had time to come up, but there was no unanimity in the councils of the enemy. The Bavarian generals wanted to defend Bavaria. The imperialist generals wanted to defend the still remaining Austrian possessions in Swabia. The invaders were allowed to accomplish their purpose. They arrived at the gates of Munich before the citizens knew what had become of their master's army. With grim purpose, Turenne and Wrangel set themselves to make desolate the Bavarian plain, so that it might be rendered incapable of supporting a Bavarian army. Maximilian was reduced to straits such as he had not known since the time when Tilly fell at the passage of the Lech. Sorely against his will, he signed, in May 1647, a separate truce with the enemy. The truce did not last long. In September, Maximilian was once more on the Emperor's side. Bavaria paid dearly for the Elector's defection. All that had been spared a year before fell a sacrifice to a new devastation. The last great battle of the war was fought at Zusmarshausen on May 17th, 1648. The Bavarians were defeated, and the work of the destroyer went on yet for a while unchecked. In Bohemia, half of Prague fell into the hands of the Swedes, and the Emperor was left unaided to bear up in the unequal fight. End of section 48. Section 49 of the 30 Years' War by Samuel Rawson Gardiner. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by Pamela Nagami. Chapter 11, Section 2. The Treaty of Westphalia, October 1648. Ferdinand could resist no longer. On the 24th of October, 1648, a few months before Charles I ascended the scaffold at Whitehall, the Peace of Westphalia was signed. The religious difficulty in Germany was settled as it ought to have been settled long before. Calvinism was to be placed on the same footing as Lutheranism. New Year's Day, 1624, was fixed upon as the date by which all disputes were to be tested. Whatever ecclesiastical benefice was in Catholic hands at that date was to remain in Catholic hands forever. Ecclesiastical benefices in Protestant hands at that date were to remain in Protestant keeping. Catholics would never again be able to lay claim to the bishoprics of the north. Even Halberstadt, which had been retained at the Peace of Prague, was now lost to them. To make this settlement permanent, the imperial court was reconstituted. Protestants and Catholics were to be members of the court in equal numbers, and if the judicial body was such as to make it certain that its sanction would never be given to an infringement of the peace, the Catholic majority in the Diet became powerless for evil. In political matters, Maximilian permanently united the Upper Palatinate to his Duchy of Bavaria, and the electorate was confirmed to him and his descendants. An eighth electorate was created in favour of Charles Louis, the worthless son of the Elector Frederick, and the Lower Palatinate was given up to him. Sweden established herself firmly on the mouths of the great northern rivers. The eastern part of Pomerania she surrendered to Brandenburg. But western Pomerania, including within its frontier both banks of the lower Vistula, was surrendered to her, whilst the possession of the bishoprics of Bremen and Verdun, on which Christian of Denmark had set his eyes at the beginning of the war, gave her a commanding position at the mouths of the Elbe and Weser. The bishoprics of Halberstadt, Kamen, Minden, and the greater part of the diocese of Magdeburg were made over to Brandenburg as a compensation for the loss of its claims to the whole of Pomerania, whilst a smaller portion of the diocese of Magdeburg was assigned to Saxony, that power, as a matter of course, retaining Lusatia. France, as a matter of course, retained its conquests. It kept its hold upon Austria and Alsace, Strasbourg as a free city, and the immediate vassals of the empire being, however, excluded from the cession. The strong fortress of Philipsburg, erected by the warlike Elector of Trier, received a French garrison, and the three bishoprics of Metz, Toul, and Verdun, which had been practically under French rule since the days of Henry II of France, were now formally separated from the empire. Equally formal was the separation of Switzerland and the Netherlands, both of which countries had long been practically independent. The importance of the Peace of Westphalia in European history goes far beyond these territorial changes. That France should have a few miles more and Germany a few miles less, or even that France should have acquired military and political strength while Germany lost it, are facts which in themselves need not have any very great interest for others than Frenchmen or Germans. That which gives to the Peace of Westphalia its prominent place among treaties is that it drew a final demarcation between the two religions which divided Europe. The struggle in England and France for the right of settling their own religious affairs without the interference of foreign nations had been brought to a close in the 16th century. In Germany it had not been brought to a close, for the simple reason that it was not decided how far Germany was a nation at all. The government of England or France could tolerate or persecute at home, as far as its power or inclination permitted, But the central government of Germany was not strong enough to enforce its will upon the territorial governments, nor, on the other hand, were the territorial governments strong enough to enforce their will without regard for the central government. 30 years of war ended by a compromise, under which the religious position of each territory was fixed by the intervention of foreign powers, whilst the rights of the central government were entirely ignored. Such a settlement was by no means necessarily in favour of religious toleration. The right of an elector of Bavaria or an elector of Saxony to impose his belief by force upon his dissident subjects was even more fully acknowledged than before. He could still give them their choice between conversion or banishment. As late as 1729, an archbishop of Salzburg could drive thousands of industrious Protestants into exile from his Alpine valleys, leaving a void behind them which has not been filled up to this day. But if such cases were rare, their rarity was indirectly owing to the Peace of Westphalia. In 1617, a bishop who had to consider the question of religious persecution had to consider it with the fear of Christian of Anhalt before his eyes. Every Protestant in his dominions was a possible traitor, who would favour, if he did not actively support, the revolutionary attacks of the neighbouring Protestants. In 1649, all such fear was at an end for ever. The bishop was undisputed master of his territory, and he could look on with contemptuous indifference if a few of his subjects had sufficient love of singularity to profess a religion other than his own. It may perhaps be said that the assurance given by the Peace of Westphalia was, after all, no better than the assurance given by the Peace of Augsburg. But even so far as the letter of the two documents was concerned, this was very far from being the case. The Peace of Augsburg was full of uncertainties, because the contracting parties were unable to abandon their respective desires. In the Peace of Westphalia, all was definite. Evasion or misinterpretation was no longer possible. If the letter of the two treaties was entirely different, it was because the spirit in which they were conceived was also entirely different. In 1555, Protestantism was on the rise. The Peace of 1555 was a vain attempt to shut out the tide by artificial dikes and barriers. In 1648, the tide had receded. The line which divided the Protestant from the Catholic princes formed almost an exact division between the Protestant and Catholic populations. The desire for making proselytes, once so strong on both sides, had been altogether extinguished by the numbing agony of the war. All Germany longed for peace with an inexpressible longing. The mutual distrust of Catholic and Protestant had grown exceedingly dull. The only feeling yet alive was hatred of the tyranny and exactions of the soldiers. End of section 49. Section 50 of the 30 Years' War by Samuel Rawson Gardiner. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Pamela Nagami. Chapter 11, Section 3. Condition of Germany. What a peace it was when it really came at last! Whatever life there was under that deadly blast of war had been attracted to the camps. The strong man who had lost his all turned soldier, that he might be able to rob others in turn. The young girl, who in better times would have passed on to a life of honourable wedlock with some youth who had been the companion of her childhood in the sports around the village fountain, had turned aside for very starvation to a life of shame in the train of one or other of the armies by which her home had been made desolate. In the later years of the war, it was known that a body of 40,000 fighting men drew along with it a loathsome following of no less than 140,000 men, women, and children, contributing nothing to the efficiency of the army, and all of them living at the expense of the miserable peasants who still contrived to hold on to their ruined fields. If these were to live, they must steal what yet remained to be stolen. They must devour with the insatiable hunger of locusts what yet remained to be devoured. And then if sickness came, or wounds, and sickness was no infrequent visitor in those camps, what remained but misery or death? Nor was it much better with the soldiers themselves. No careful surgeons passed over the battlefield to save life or limb. No hospitals received the wounded to the tender nursing of loving, gentle hands. Recruits were to be bought cheaply, and it cost less to enroll a new soldier than to cure an old one. The losses of the civil population were almost incredible. In a certain district of Thuringia, which was probably better off than the greater part of Germany, there were, before the war cloud burst, 1,717 houses standing in 19 villages. In 1649, only 627 houses were left, and even of the houses which remained, many were untenanted. The 1,717 houses had been inhabited by 1,773 families. Only 316 families could be found to occupy the 627 houses. Property fared still worse. In the same district, 244 oxen alone remained of 1,402. Of 4,616 sheep, not one was left. 2 centuries later, the losses thus suffered were scarcely recovered. And as is always the case, the physical decline of the population was accompanied by moral decadence. Men who had been accustomed to live by the strong arm, and men who had been accustomed to suffer all things from those who were strong, met one another, even in the days of peace, without that mutual respect which forms the basis of well-ordered life. Courts were crowded with feather-brained soldiers, whose highest ambition was to bedeck themselves in a splendid uniform and to copy the latest fashion or folly which was in vogue at Paris or Versailles. In the country district, a narrow-minded gentry, without knowledge or culture, domineered over all around, and strove to exact the uttermost farthing from the peasant in order to keep up the outward appearance of rank. The peasant, whose father had been bullied by marauding soldiers, dared not lift up his head against the exactions of the squire. The burden of the general impoverishment fell heavily upon his shoulders. The very pattern of the chairs on which he sat, of the vessels out of which he ate and drank, assumed a ruder appearance than they had borne before the war. In all ranks, life was meaner, poorer, harder than it had been at the beginning of the century. If much of all this was the result of the war, something was owing to causes antecedently at work. The German people in the beginning of the 17th century was plainly inferior to the German people in the beginning of the 16th century. During the whole course of the war, Maximilian of Bavaria was the only man of German birth who rose to eminence, and even he did not attain the first rank. The destinies of the land of Luther and Goethe, of Frederick II and Stein, were decided by a few men of foreign birth. Wallenstein was a Slavonian, Tilly a Walloon, Gustavus a Swede, Richelieu a Frenchman. The penalty borne by a race which was unable to control individual vigour within the limits of a large and fruitful national life was that individual vigour itself died out. We may well leave to those who like such tasks the work of piling up articles of accusation against this man or that, of discovering that the war was all the fault of Ferdinand, or all the fault of Frederick, as party feeling may lead them. Probably the most lenient judgment is also the truest one. With national and territorial institutions, the mere chaos which they were, an amount of political intelligence was needed to set them right, which would be rare in any country or in any age. As far as national institutions were concerned, the 30 Years' War made a clean sweep in Germany. Nominally, it is true, emperor and empire still remained. Ferdinand III was still, according to his titles, head of all Christendom, if not of the whole human race. The Diet still gathered to discuss the affairs of the empire. The imperial court, re-established on the principle of equality between the two religions, still met to dispense justice between the estates of the empire. But from these high-sounding names all reality had fled. The rule over German men had passed for many a long day into the hands of the princes. It was for the princes to strive with one another in peace or war under the protection of foreign alliances. And by, half consciously, half unconsciously, to compete for the leadership of Germany by the intelligence and discipline which they were able to foster under their sway. When the days of this competition arrived, it was of inestimable advantage to Germany that whatever else had been lost, Protestantism had been saved. Wherever Protestantism had firmly rooted itself, there sprang up in course of time a mighty race of intellectual giants. Goethe and Schiller, Lessing and Kant, Stein and Humboldt, with thousands more of names which have made German intellect a household word in the whole civilized world, sprung from Protestant Germany. When Bavaria, scarcely more than 2 generations ago, awoke to the consciousness that she had not more than the merest rudiments of education to give her children, she had to apply to the Protestant North for teachers. For Germany, in 1648, the worst was over. Physically, at least, she had no more to suffer. One page of her history was closed, and another had not yet been opened. She lay for a time in the insensibility of exhaustion. End of section 50. Section 51 of the 30 Years' War by Samuel Rawson Gardiner. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by Pamela Nagami. Chapter 11, Section 4. Continuance of the War between France and Spain, 1648 to 1660. For France, 1648 is hardly a date at all. She was rid of the war in Germany, but her war with Spain was not brought to an end. And if Spain would no longer have the support of the imperialists of Germany, France was at the same time deprived of the support of a far more vigorous ally. Spain at last lowered its haughty neck to accept conditions of peace on terms of equality from the Dutch Republic. The 80 Years' War of the Netherlands was brought to a conclusion simultaneously with the 30 Years' War of Germany. Spain could now send reinforcements to Flanders by sea without fearing the overwhelming superiority of the Dutch marine, and could defend the southern frontier of the obedient provinces without having to provide against an attack in the rear. In the long run, a duel between France and Spain could be of no doubtful issue. It was a contest between the old system of immobility and intolerance and the new system of intelligence and tolerance, between a government which despised industry and commerce and a government which fostered them. But however excellent might be the aims which the French government kept in view, it was still in its nature an absolute government. No free discussion enlightened its judgment. No popular intervention kept in check its caprices. It was apt to strike roughly and ignorantly, to wound many feelings, and to impose grievous burdens upon the poor and the weak, whose lamentations never reached the height of the throne. Suddenly, when Mazarin's government appeared most firmly rooted, there was an explosion which threatened to change the whole face of France. An outcry arose for placing restrictions upon the rights of the crown, for establishing constitutional and individual liberties. The Fronde, as the party which uttered the cry was called, did its best to imitate the English Long Parliament, whose deeds were then ringing through the world. But there were no elements in France upon which to establish constitutional government. The Parliament of Paris, which wished itself to be considered the chief organ of that government, was a close corporation of lawyers who had bought or inherited judicial places. And of all governments, a government in the hands of a close corporation of lawyers is likely in the long run to be the most narrow-minded and unprogressive of all possible combinations. For it is the business of a lawyer to administer the law as it exists, not to modify it in accordance with the new facts which rise constantly to the surface of social and political life. Nor were the lawyers of the Parliament fortunate in their supporters. The Paris mob, combined with a knot of intriguing courtiers, could form no firm basis for a healthy revolution. It was still worse when Condé, quarrelling on a personal question with Mazarin, raised the standard of aristocratic revolt and threw himself into the arms of the Spanish invader. Mazarin and the young king represented the nation against aristocratic selfishness and intrigue, and when they obtained the services of Turenne, the issue was hardly doubtful. In 1652, Louis XIV entered Paris in triumph. In 1653, Condé, in conjunction with a Spanish army, invaded France and pushed on hopefully for Paris. But Turenne was there with a handful of troops, and if Condé was the successor of Gustavus in the art of fighting battles, Turenne was Wallenstein's successor in the art of strategy. Condé could neither fight nor advance with effect. The siege and reduction of Rocroi was the only result of a campaign which had been commenced in the expectation of reducing France to submission. In 1654, Condé and the Spaniards laid siege to Arras, while the French were besieging Stenay. Stenay was taken, Arras was relieved. In 1655, further progress was made by the French on the frontier of the Netherlands, but in 1656 they failed in the siege of Valenciennes. With the check thus inflicted, a new danger appeared above the horizon. In England there had arisen under Cromwell a new and powerful military state upon the ruins of the monarchy of the Stuarts. To Cromwell Spain addressed itself with the most tempting offers. The old English jealousy of France and the political advantage of resisting its growing strength were urged in favour of a Spanish alliance. Cromwell might renew the old glories of the Plantagenets, and might gather round him the forces of the Huguenots of the south. If Charles I had failed at Rochelle, Cromwell might establish himself firmly at Bordeaux. For a moment Cromwell was shaken. Then he made two demands of the Spanish ambassador. He must have, he said, freedom for Englishmen to trade in the Indies, and permission for Englishmen carrying on commercial intercourse with Spain to profess their religion openly without interference. "To give you this," was the Spaniard's cool reply, "would be to give you my master's 2 eyes." To beat down religious exclusiveness and commercial exclusiveness was the work to which Cromwell girded himself. An alliance with France was quickly made. The arrogant intolerance of Spain was to perish through its refusal to admit the new principle of toleration. The politic tolerance of France was to rise to still higher fortunes by the admission of the principle on which all its successes had been based since Richelieu's accession to power. In 1657, 6,000 of Cromwell's Ironsides landed to take part in continental warfare. The union of Turenne's strategy with the valour and discipline which had broken down opposition at Naseby and Worcester was irresistible. That autumn the small Flemish port of Mardyke surrendered. In 1658 Dunkirk was taken and given over, according to compact, to the English auxiliaries. But France too reaped an ample harvest. Gravelines, Oudenarde, Ypres saw the white flag of France flying from their ramparts. Spain was reduced to seek for peace. In 1660, the Treaty of the Pyrenees, a supplement, as it were, to the Treaty of Westphalia, put an end to the long war. The advantages of the peace were all on the side of France. Roussillon and Artois, with Thionville, Landrecies, and Avesnes, were incorporated with France. Another condition was pregnant with future evil. Louis XIV gave his hand to the sister of Philip IV of Spain, the next heiress to the Spanish monarchy, after the sickly infant who became afterwards the imbecile and childish Charles II. At her marriage, she abandoned all right to the great inheritance, but even at the time there were not wanting Frenchmen of authority to point to circumstances which rendered the renunciation null and void. Richelieu's power had been based upon tolerance at home and moderation abroad. Was it likely that his successors would always imitate his example? What guarantee could be given that the French monarchy would not turn its back upon the principles from which its strength had been derived? In a land of free discussion, every gain is a permanent one. When Protestantism or toleration or freedom of the press or freedom of trade had been once accepted in England, they were never abandoned. They became articles of popular belief, on which no hesitation, except by scattered individuals, was possible. Multitudes who would find it difficult to give a good reason why they thought one thing to be true and another untrue, had yet a hazy confidence in the result of the battle of reason which had taken place, much in the same way as there are millions of people in the world who believe implicitly that the earth goes round the sun, without being able to give a reason for their belief. In France, it was hard for anything of the kind to take place. Tolerance was admitted there by the mere will of the government in the 17th century, just as free trade was admitted by the mere will of the government in the 19th century. The hand that gave could also take away, and it depended on the young king to decide whether he would walk in the steps of the great minister who had cleared the way before him, or whether he would wander into devious paths of his own seeking. At first, everything promised well. A great statesman, Colbert, filled the early part of the manhood of Louis XIV with a series of domestic reforms, the least of which would have gladdened the heart of Richelieu. Taxation was reduced. The tolls taken upon the passage of goods from one province to another were diminished in number. Trade and industry were encouraged. The administration of justice was improved. All, in short, that it was possible to do within the circle of one man's activity was done to make France a prosperous and contented land. But the happy time was not of long duration. The war fever took possession of Louis. The lust of absolute domination entered into his heart. He became the tyrant and bully of Europe, and as abroad he preferred to be feared rather than to be loved, at home he would be content with nothing else than the absolute mastery over the consciences as well as over the hearts of his subjects. The Edict of Nantes, issued by Henry IV and confirmed by the policy of Richelieu, was revoked, and intolerance and persecution became the law of the French monarchy, as it had been the law of the Spanish monarchy. It was not for this that Henry IV and Richelieu had laboured. The tree that bears no fruit must be cut down to the ground, or it will perish by its own inherent rottenness. As the Empire had fallen, as the Spanish monarchy had fallen, the French monarchy, shaken by the thunders of La Hougue and Blenheim, fell at last when, amidst the corruption of Versailles, it ceased to do any useful work for man. End of section 51. Read by Pamela Nagami, M.D., in Encino, California, August 2023. End of the 30 Years' War, 1618 to 1648, by Samuel Rawson Gardiner.